All set?
All right. And we're live.
Okay. Well, wonderful to see all of you. Great you are part of our monthly event, our monthly fireside event. And we're really delighted this month to have Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi be our speaker. Uh, Before I introduce Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi, we will have two opening prayers, and I'll say a couple of thoughts, share a couple of thoughts about Dr. Mahmoudi and her resume. Um, but before I say anything, it is important for everybody to understand that the world we live in is preparing for war. We're buying guns and weapons and submarines and ships and all that, preparing for war. We Baha'is are one of the few groups that is actually preparing for peace. And in that role, in that preparing for peace, Dr. Mahmoudi plays a vital, important part. We are a small effort in preparing for peace. Our hope is that the work of Dr. Mahmoudi and other friends like her would multiply, keep going till we at least get to a point where we are talking about peace and preparing for peace rather than spending billions of dollars every year on preparing for war. With that said, I want to ask Linda Odell to say the first prayer, followed by Adib Masumia. All yours. You mute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The promised day is come, and the Lord of hosts hath appeared. Rejoice ye with great joy by reason of this supreme felicity. Aid him then through the power of wisdom and utterance. Thus biddeth you the one who hath ever proclaimed, verily no God is there but me, the all-knowing, the all-wise. May his glory rest upon thee and upon those who are with thee, and such ones as cherish thee, and give ear to the words thou utterest in glorification of this mighty, this transcendent revelation. Baha'u'llah.
O my God, verily I invoke thee and supplicate before thy threshold, asking thee that all thy mercies may descend upon these souls. Specialize them for thy favor and thy truth. O Lord, unite and bind together the hearts. Join and accord all the souls, and exhilarate the spirits through the signs of thy sanctity and oneness. O Lord, make these faces radiant through the light of thy oneness. Strengthen the loins of thy servants in the service of thy kingdom. O Lord, thou possessor of infinite mercy, O Lord of forgiveness and pardon, forgive our sins, pardon our shortcomings, and cause us to turn to the kingdom of thy clemency. Invoking the kingdom of might and power, humble at thy shrine, and submissive before the glory of thine evidences. O Lord God, make us as waves of the sea, as flowers of the garden, united, agreed through the bounties of thy love. O Lord, dilate the breasts through the signs of thy oneness, and make all mankind as stars shining from the same height of glory, as perfect fruits growing upon thy tree of life. Verily thou art the Almighty, the self-subsistent, the giver, the forgiving, the pardoner, the omniscient, the one creator. Abdul Baha.
Thank you, Adib, Linda. Beloved friends, this talk that Dr. Mahmoudi will do tonight is here on Zoom. In addition to Zoom, this talk is also being broadcast via YouTube and Facebook. Now, one of the requests is that all of you that have any questions for Dr. Mahmoudi, please type those into the chat segment if you're on Zoom. If you are not on Zoom and if you're on YouTube or Facebook, I'm going to give you my cell number. Please text me your questions. I will read them to Dr. Mahmoudi after her talk. Ready? 281-788-0380. 281-788-0380. Send me your question via text and tell me what your name is so I can tell Dr. Mahmoudi so-and-so is asking the following question. With that, let me introduce you to Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi. By the way, I did remind her, even though she says she doesn't remember me, I did meet her in Haifa when she was serving there. So Professor Hoda Mahmoudi has held the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, College Park since 2012. As chair, she studied structural racism and root causes of prejudice, equality of women as prerequisites for peace, human nature, global governance and globalization, and environment. As director of this endowed academic program, Professor Mahmoudi collaborates with a wide range of scholars, researchers, and practitioners to advance interdisciplinary analysis and open discourse on global peace. Before joining the University of Maryland faculty, Professor Mahmoudi served as the coordinator of the research department at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel. Prior to that, Dr. Mahmoudi was dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northeastern Illinois University, where she was also a faculty member in the Department of Sociology. Professor Mahmoudi is co-editor of Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Human Rights and Human Dignity and of Children and Globalization, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. Professor Mahmoudi is also co-author of A World Without War, Abdul Baha and the Discourse for Global Peace. She will publish a co-edited volume entitled The Changing Ethos of Human Rights. And I think this last book has been published already and is available. Is it not, Hoda?
Which one?
The Abdul Baha and the Discourse for Global
Yes.
Peace.
Yes.
Yeah, that is available. Tonight, Professor Mahmoudi's topic is becoming the cause of global peace towards a world without war. Dr. Mahmoudi, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Ajit, for that beautiful introduction. I appreciate this opportunity to speak about this very important topic of world peace, which I know at this time in the world, we may feel like it's a very, very distant goal, but we'll explore it anyway and see what you think. I wanted to begin by bringing to your attention a book that it's called War, How Conflict Shaped Us. It's by historian Margaret Macmillan. And the reason I want to just share this a little bit from this book is because it's very relevant to the talk tonight. She says, we may wish war away and hope that it only happens somewhere else or in another time. But it remains one of the key driving forces in human history. She says, what is undeniable is that war and human society are so deeply interwoven that we cannot understand the development of one part from the other. We must understand the nature of that relationship and the power and dynamics of war itself, if we are to have any hope of bringing it under control. Now, she explains how in her research, and it's pretty thorough research, she suggests that when humans changed from nomads to agricultural or farming communities, that this was really the first origins of war as we know it today. because she explains that nomadic populations had to move constantly to get their food and to get their resources. And so they couldn't have too many possessions. They had to travel light, if you will. And then she says, when humanity began forming farming communities, this is the first time that they were in settlements. They had now settled down. And now they had possessions. They had food, they lived in some kind of shelter, etc., etc. And therefore, they had to find a way to protect themselves from invaders. And according to Macmillan, this is the time when walls were built, if you will, and weaponry was discovered, and an army of sorts was formed in order to protect these agricultural settlements. So then she, I won't go into the whole thing, but she raises an interesting point, which is relevant then to the talk that I'm about to give about the Baha'i perspective on peace. She said, war is not merely an important part of our history. It is our present. And barring some revolution in human consciousness, it is also in our future as well. So she's saying, war is extremely important for us to understand because we've created a culture of war. And she said, it is our present, and barring some revolution in human consciousness, unless there's some kind of a revolution in the way we think about war and how to maybe find ways to eliminate it, our future is at hand. We don't know how things will work out, because she goes on in the book to talk about how already we're planning technology for space wars. So, I leave that point of hers, and I will come back to that later on. So tonight's talk, I will really go through, I will travel, if you will, with you through the Baha'i faith's core, its whole essence as a religion, which promotes what it feels is now the age of advancing humanity towards global peace. And in so doing, I will cover many of the key components of the Baha'i teachings, which hold the religion in its entirety as a religion that in every way promotes a better, more peaceful existence. So the Baha'i faith is the most recent of the world's monotheistic religions. It originated in mid-19th century. Its prophet and founder, Baha'u'llah, summarized the principal mission of his religion as the realization of the oneness of the peoples of the world and the establishment of peace among the nations. The theme of peace infuses every aspect of the Baha'i faith. Its doctrines, ideals, practices, and institutional structures all speak to the necessity of peace both in the world and in the individual. For Baha'is, peace is viewed as the outcome of a broader spiritual and material understanding that unifies not only peoples, nations, and religions, but also bridges the gulf between the realms of the secular and the spiritual. Thus, it is critical to view the concept of peace within a Baha'i context as different from the concept of peace within a secular context. Baha'is consider every human being and every collectivity, whether Baha'i or not, to be an essential participant and agent in this process. The goal of the Baha'i faith and the thrust of the Baha'i writings is to equip individuals for the work of creating peace Baha'u'llah's writings and those of his successors describe the specific ideas, principles, and laws needed to attain peace. These writings serve as a blueprint for a process-oriented, long process-oriented approach towards global peace, articulating a vision of unity and peace between, as I said, the peoples and nations of the world. Baha'u'llah's universal peace is an evolutionary process that progresses towards greater levels of human coordination. For Baha'u'llah, such coordination signifies the approaching of an age of human oneness, a oneness indicative of the Baha'i faith. In order to secure this oneness, a significant reconstruction of the social order is required. When one thinks of peace, the concept of nonviolence comes first to mind. The Baha'i writings unequivocally forbid conflict of all kinds, whether in words or actions, and violence is also prohibited, both physical and emotional. In his Book of Laws, Baha'u'llah states not only that it is forbidden to engage in contention and conflict, to strike another, but even to commit similar acts whereby hearts and souls may be saddened. As is generally recognized, however, the absence of conflict or war is not sufficient for peace. In fact, the absence of war does not mean necessarily that we will have a peaceful world. Although the Baha'i writings address the prevention of war and the preservation of peace at the international level, a comprehensive concept of peace must address the question at the root, at the level of the individual. For Baha'is, the root of peace lies at the level of the individual. For Baha'is, both the purpose and existence of human life is to serve and improve the conditions of society. Once embraced, that vision becomes the basis for an overarching ethic of peace and the pattern for living and experiencing peace. Now, I want to just say that Baha'u'llah in his writings explains that God created everything in creation out of his love for creation, and especially out of his love for human beings. Therefore, Baha'is believe that this love of creation is something that as individuals, if we love God, we must also love his creation, which means all human beings. So this is a very important concept that begins at the individual level. By acknowledging their intrinsic connection and relationship to God, which originates in love, individuals can comprehend their relationships and obligations to all other human beings. Regardless of culture, language, religion, ethnicity, or any other distinctions, all human beings are members of an organic unit, one moral community. As such, they owe each other duties of both justice and caring. The Baha'i writings provide laws and principles and institutions that are intended to serve as a pattern for a future society, a supreme instrument for the establishment of global peace. The pivotal principle, which I mentioned earlier, is the oneness and unity of humankind. Like peace, the Baha'i concept of unity is not simply an expression of vague and pious hope, nor is it a plea for reawakening the spirit of brotherhood and goodwill among men. The implications of human oneness, or this concept of the oneness of humankind, in this age are far more complex and much more broad than that. Their imperative focus is the nature of those essential relationships that must bind all the states and nations as members of one human family. So even though peace starts with the individual, it travels ultimately to the rulers, leaders, and the nations of the world. The principle implies that the social evolution of humanity has entered a stage that demands vital changes as a consequence of the reconceptualization of its nature as a global community. We are now in a global community, and we have to now, in every way possible, begin to behave like we live in a global community. Writing in the early 1900s, Abdu'l-Baha, who's the son of Baha'u'llah and became the head of the faith after his passing, explained that humanity's oneness has always been an implicit fact, although the necessity of its full realization and recognition has only emerged in the conditions of modernity, in other words, in more recent times. He says, in cycles gone by, though harmony was established, yet because of the absence of means, the unity of mankind couldn't be achieved. He says, continents remained widely divided, even among the peoples of one and the same continent. Association and interchange of thought were well nigh impossible. But he says, in this day, means of communication have multiplied, and the 5 continents of the earth have virtually merged into one. In like manner, all the members of the human family, whether peoples or governments, cities or villages, have become increasingly interdependent. And we might just contemplate at the present time in our history how much technology, including this very Zoom session, and our cell phones and whatever aspect of technology, how much this world has become so interconnected that news travels at the speed of light. And it is just very few regions of the world that could be considered as totally isolated in this world. So the world has changed. It has in every way become very much interconnected. So the historical movement towards global peace is described by Baha'u'llah as occurring through a dual process of social and spiritual evolution. By social evolution for humanity, he means that humanity, as actually this book on war explains, has moved from family units to clans, to tribes, to the formation of city-states and the establishment of sovereign nations historically. Spiritual, so that's the social evolution. Spiritual evolution, referred to by Baha'u'llah as progressive revelation, involves religions, religion as a single institution, its gradual unfoldment as in each age, the prophet founders of God impart spiritual knowledge and establish laws suited to the historical circumstances of the time in which that religion is revealed. So there is really, from the Baha'i perspective, all religions come from one source, which is a monotheistic God, and they are not in competition with each other. They have come at different times under different names and different prophets' names for the purpose of bringing laws and teachings that are relevant for that age in which they were revealed. Although the Baha'i faith is not regarded as being the final revelation, it does signify a distinctive new epoch in religious history in which humanity's social, political, and spiritual unification will be attained as the prerequisites of universal peace, that is the last and highest stage in the evolution of humankind's collective life on this planet. So the pathway to universal peace comprises many stages and involves the removal of barriers that separate the peoples and nations of the world, leading to unity on an ever widening scale. So that's the process. It's moving towards unity, but it is moving in such ways that it increases unity in different realms of society. On the international level, the establishment of justice will foster the emergence of unity within the global community. The Baha'i writings speak of the stage of the unity of nations as arising from a recognition among the peoples of the various nations that they are members of one human family. In fact, the head of the Baha'i faith now, which is an institution referred to as the Universal House of Justice, wrote about the unity of nations, saying that the unity of nations has been established in the world during the 20th century. And this is very important. In other words, by the end of the 20th century, there was this recognition among the peoples and the nations of the world of one human family. This awareness came about. Now, the other unities that are mentioned in the Baha'i writings, but not chronologically, are the unity in the political realm, which I will talk about in just a minute. And this should be developed by politically independent sovereign states. Another is the unity of freedom, which relates to the establishment of equal status among the federated nations, among all the nations of the world. Unity of thought in world undertakings. Unity, which again, how do we distribute the resources of the planet? How do we deal with climate change? What do we do with economic crises? What do we do with the pandemic? These are things that have to be addressed through the unity of world undertakings. Unity of religion is yet another of these circles of unity that lead towards peace. Unity of races, the coming together of humanity as one race, recognition of that. And the unity of language, a language in addition to one's mother tongue, involving the selection of a language by the international order for international use, which provides the means for communicating with one another without having to always have an interpreter in between. Another important principle embedded in the Baha'i writings that is also considered one of the barriers to peace, like these others, is the achievement of full equality for women. In fact, this principle of Baha'u'llah's is described as a prerequisite to world peace. So it's a critical element. Without full equality of women with men, you cannot have a global, a planetary system which can become peaceful. And I want to read a short quotation from a publication from the Universal House of Justice, which addresses this issue of the equality of women. It states that the emancipation of women, the achievement of full equality between the sexes, is one of the most important, though less acknowledged, prerequisites of peace. The denial of such equality perpetrates an injustice against one half of the world's population and promotes in men harmful attitudes and habits that are carried from the family to the workplace to political life and ultimately to international relations. Only as women are welcomed into full partnership in all fields of human endeavor, will the moral and psychological climate be created in which international peace can emerge. So a very important principle, and as the House of Justice said, one that is less acknowledged. So this multifaceted, complex vision for global peace is to be accomplished by the application of Baha'i laws, as I said, principles and ideals at every level of society, individual, communal, institutional. For Baha'is, the individual spiritual life is not separate from the realm of society. Baha'u'llah counseled that all should be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age in which they live, and that they should center their deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. Likewise, each individual is encouraged to dedicate his or her life to the service of the entire human race and to promote the best interests of the peoples and kindreds of the earth. The concept of the organic unity and interconnectedness of all the component parts of humanity, whether individual persons, nations, religions, or other groups, implies an ethic defined by unity of interest. Again, I want to focus. It implies an ethic defined by unity of interests, and therefore the subordination of national consideration and particularistic interests to the imperative and paramount claims of humanity as a whole. In other words, and this is from the Baha'i writings, inasmuch as in a world of interdependent nations and peoples, the advantage of the part is best served by the advantage of the whole. How will we solve climate change if we don't think beyond the national? How will we solve economic crises if we don't think beyond the national? In other words, we need to put all of our interests in how to organize this planet so that it functions better and promotes the well-being of humanity as a whole. So as individuals seek to understand, internalize, and act on the Word of God, which are the teachings of Baha'u'llah for Baha'is, their understanding of the nature of social reality and of their role as agents of its transformation expands to higher levels. So this is the process that every Baha'i engages in. The conscious efforts of individuals to pursue their own personal spiritual transformation by reflecting in their words and deeds the Baha'i principles of the equality of all human beings, ridding themselves of prejudices acquired from the society around them, and developing attributes and virtues including justice, trustworthiness, love, kindness, humility, fidelity, and generosity. These produce the spiritual transformation of the individual, of communities, of institutions, and ultimately nations. So peace building, again, begins with the individual, expands to the group, enters the institution, ascends to the nation, and eventually touches every corner of the earth. So Abdul Baha himself said, peace must first be established among individuals until it leadeth in the end to peace among the nations. So the other aspects of the Baha'i religion that relate to peace are perhaps ones that we don't often think about, but I want to cover some of these. One is the principle that the Baha'is are to uphold, which is obedience to the government. And it's linked to the Baha'i belief that justice, unity, and cooperation and order are the foundation for social stability that is essential to building peaceful societies and a peaceful international order. Baha'is therefore obey the laws of the land in which they live, provided doing so does not require them to violate their religious beliefs. The Baha'i approach to political involvement flows from the principle of unity, which implies the rejection of partisan politics and factionalism. Baha'is do not participate in civil disobedience in the form of a conscious decision to violate the law to effect social change, whatever merit it appears to have had in a particular political setting. The principle of non-involvement in politics and obedience to government, far from being obstacles to social change, are aspects of an approach set forth in the Baha'i writings to actually implement effective remedies for and address the root causes of the ills afflicting society. This approach includes active involvement on the part of the Baha'is in the life of society, as well as the possibility of influencing and contributing to the social policies of government by all lawful means. Indeed, service to others and to society is a hallmark of the Baha'i life. So Baha'is exercise their civil responsibility to vote in civil elections without identifying with any party, while respecting citizens who serve their country and engage in political activity. The approach adopted by the Baha'i community of non-involvement in such activity is not intended as a statement expressing some fundamental objection to politics in its true sense. Indeed, humanity organizes itself through its political affairs. Although Baha'is do not accept political posts, which may be partisan, they do hold non-partisan administrative positions. And the Baha'i writings acknowledge the legitimate place of power in human affairs, including governmental power, particularly when institutions are granted authority through the will of the people. So this is acknowledged by the Baha'is. However, political processes, like other processes in life, should not remain unaffected by the powers of the human spirit that the Baha'i faith, and for that matter, every religious tradition promotes. And it hopes that religion is actually tapped into in order to create a political structure that is more meaningful in terms of serving the needs of the people that political or government is responsible for. The power of unity, of love, of humble service, of pure deeds, these are the important attributes of how even leaders serve their citizens. So the exercise of power from this perspective encourages, enables, it releases human potential and capacities to build a path towards bettering society. Now, another principle that's very important that Baha'u'llah places enormous emphasis on is the acquisition of knowledge, both secular and spiritual knowledge. Baha'u'llah says that everyone should be granted opportunities to have knowledge and to acquire knowledge. And that this knowledge is vital to the peace of the world. It's indispensable for the spiritual, social, and political or economic well-being of society. Because without knowledge, one cannot begin to apply the solutions to these problems. Likewise, the Baha'i principle of the harmony between science and religion is also extremely important, especially in relation to building a peaceful world. For Baha'is, religion and science are complementary knowledge systems that shape human perception of reality and propel the progress of civilization. Religion conveys values or ethics, morals, whatever you want to refer to them as, in terms of how religion progressively brings divine teachings to the world, so that those attributes, the spiritual attributes, is the part that religion plays in this relationship between science and religion. And religion, and science is the instrumentality through which the human mind explores and is able to exert its influence over, more precisely, the phenomenal world. So religion provides the spiritual principles, science carries out through the scientific method ways to find solutions to these problems. Now, one can see that both of these, science and religion, advance the evolution of humankind. Faith protects science from unethical and corrupt tendencies, religion, while science protects faith or religion from fundamentalist and superstitious thinking. One other thing I want to add, and this is directly from the Baha'i writings, if religion promotes fanaticism, it is better to do without religion and turn to science. But at the same time, science without the ethical or spiritual teachings of religion can also lead to barbarism, which we have witnessed in this world over and over again. So now I would like to move on to what is called the covenant, which is another aspect of why the Baha'i faith in its entirety is a religion of peace. One of the greatest obstacles to peace has been religious conflict, both between and within religions. In the Baha'i view, the individual religions, as part of a single unfolding historical process of divine revelation or progressive revelation, are not in their essential form in conflict with one another. The conflicts that arise between and within religions are caused by distortion of the teachings of the prophet founders through the later additions of human or man-made doctrines, and by exercise of power by religious leaders in service of their own interests, as well as by the lack of any mechanism to check the natural human tendency to divide into like-minded factions and struggle for domination. Baha'u'llah made explicit provisions in his writings to provide such a mechanism in the form of a covenant that guards against the Baha'i faith splintering into factions or sects. In this covenant, Baha'u'llah clearly established the succession of authority after his passing and founded institutions that together form the Baha'i administrative order, the democratically elected structures of institutions that administer and direct the affairs of the Baha'i community. So Baha'u'llah's covenant guarantees the integrity and the unity of a single worldwide Baha'i religion, which is an essential factor in the Baha'i faith's goal for world peace. Now, Baha'is view the process of civilizational evolution and transformation, or what we might call social change, as driven by the interactive dynamic between two sets of concurrent forces. One is disintegrative or destructive, and the other is integrative or constructive. In this stage of human or of humanity's development. The interaction between these forces impels humanity towards attaining its full maturity by demonstrating the inescapable need for global cooperation and global peace. In other words, if there are barriers to global peace, forces of integration and disintegration will work together to remove those barriers. And I want to go into this with some examples. So the forces of disintegration are disruptive and turbulent, even catastrophic at times, tearing down obsolete and corrupt processes that limit cooperation and unity. Baha'is regard the process of civilizational evolution and transformation or change as driven by these two important processes. And in terms of this, I would like to use the example of the horrific, immense devastation that was caused by the Second World War. In fact, it was such a bad war, and it caused so much suffering. Of course, the killing of 6 million Jews, innocent people, and other populations. It shifted. After World War II, the human consciousness shifted and this shift became quite apparent. Indeed, the magnitude of the destruction of human life and civilization from the combination of World War I and World War II brought on, at the end of the European Empire, it brought on the end to the European empires and their systems of colonial rule and other forms of political, social, and cultural oppression. Therefore, it was not entirely surprising that in 1945, the nations of the world finally, with their consciousness raised, displayed a willingness to create a new system of international order beyond what was the League of Nations' failed accomplishment by forming the United Nations with provisions for a peacekeeping authority. Now, although the UN isn't perfect and has not achieved the fullness of what its mission set out to accomplish, it serves as an example of how the forces of disintegration can facilitate opportunities for progress towards integration. One could not have imagined prior to World War I that any kind of a concept like a United Nations could ever be formed. But then in 1945, this occurred. Another example is when the victorious African-American soldiers serving in segregated units returned from the horrors and violence of World War I to the US, they met the all too familiar horror of violence at home in the form of racial prejudice and segregation. Unwilling to accede to these structures, African Americans sought new ways and new possibilities for freedom by migrating to the Northern American cities. The years following World War I saw race riots and lynchings throughout the American South, yet the negative forces also galvanized a quest for justice and equality that helped lead eventually to the civil rights movement 2 decades later. We're not there yet. We're not perfect with any of these, but there's always the force of disintegration and some integration that takes place. Likewise, my last example, women who entered the workforce in large numbers during World War II refused to relinquish their newfound freedoms once that war was over. Resistance to these demands led to dramatic declarations of new forms of feminism in the 50s and 60s as women struggled against the status quo, and they still continue to struggle. But again, forces of disintegration and integration were at work. So the Baha'i writings maintain that these forces are always at work throughout history. And although destructive in their effects, disintegration removes the barriers that block humanity's progress and unlocks processes that lead to integrative developments. As I said earlier, in certain instances, disintegration can lead to the absolute collapse of corrupt ideologies, such as the collapse of the former Soviet Union. And it can cause the extinction of outdated norms and institutions. While the forces of integration, which the Baha'i faith is very interested in, are constructive, unifying, and creative. Integration facilitates greater cooperation and collaboration among the peoples and nations of the world. The Baha'i writings are very clear that although the immediate future is dark and turbulent, over time, the processes of integration and disintegration will lead to a reorganization in human affairs, culminating in global unity and peace. So I'm almost to the end of my talk, but I have to talk about what I said earlier was an aspect of how the nations of the world must unite, meaning the leaders and the nations. And this is a concept in the Baha'i faith that's explained as the lesser peace. The Baha'i writings envision the progression towards peace and unification propelled by two forces unfolding in stages called the lesser peace, and after the lesser peace, the most great peace. So the lesser peace will be achieved by the nations of the world. It will happen when they decide to join together in the pursuit of equity, equality, justice, and unity among the nations. In letters that Baha'u'llah wrote in the 1860s to the world leaders, he was very clear about their responsibilities in promoting the peace of not only for their citizens, but among the nations of the world, and that they should, rather than build up armaments, they should direct those resources towards the well-being of their citizens. In a remarkable personal address to Queen Victoria, who was at that time the world's most powerful monarch, Baha'u'llah both praised her for abolishing slavery and urged her to do more to address the conditions of peace. And he also praised her for establishing parliamentary government. He said, we have also heard that you have entrusted the reins of counsel into the hands of the representatives of people. So he thought these two things were very important that a leader had worked on establishing. And he addresses many important points to these leaders of the world. He says they should regard the world as a human body, which, though it was perfect at its creation, has now been afflicted with various disorders and maladies. And he warned the world leaders against corruption, greed, and opulence, telling them that these would lead to further destruction, violence, and war. And he said what the people need from their leaders is trustworthiness. He used this word trustworthiness. And he really chastised the leaders for taxing their citizens. He says, you increase every year your expenditures, you build palaces, you create your own comforts, and yet your people are suffering and your people are having a hard time. And he said, this is not just, this is not fair, this is not proper leadership. Anyway, he told the leaders of the world that they need to reconcile among themselves their differences. They need to decrease their armaments only to the degree they can, so that they can safeguard their countries. He outlined a process of collective security for putting an end to any attempt towards aggression perpetrated by one country against another, in other words, war. He says, should anyone among you take up arms against another, rise ye all against him, collective security. Now, this collective security is in the policies of the United Nations, but it hasn't been implemented. And I think one of the reasons is that the leaders need to call a gathering, as Baha'u'llah told them, and decide on these matters and draw up treaties, draw up laws, so that everyone is held accountable. And he also said that you can't expect one country to say, okay, we will disarm. He said, unless all countries agree to lower their armaments, then we might get somewhere. In other words, for him, this concept of the lesser peace was extremely important. I mean, in his writings, he addresses this repeatedly, especially to the rulers of the world. And it isn't that he was encouraging them to come together to fix the borders of their country, to draw up principles of intergovernmental relations and international agreements and obligations. And so he's just saying that no one else can do this. Only the leaders in the world can establish this unity among the community of nations. So I want to just say, although the lesser peace is not a responsibility that the Baha'i chair or that the Baha'is themselves can promote. Baha'is cannot promote the lesser peace. The leaders of the world has to promote it. This does not mean the Baha'is are not engaged in activities that promote the lesser peace. And I want to read from the Baha'i writings that in fact say that the House of Justice, the highest institution, the head of the Baha'i faith, is responsible for promoting the lesser peace. It is incumbent, Baha'u'llah writes, upon the ministers of the House of Justice to promote the lesser peace so that the people of the earth may be relieved from the burden of exorbitant expenditures, so that the expenditures can be brought down. And though the Baha'i community itself, as I said, is not responsible for bringing about the lesser peace, the realization of it is a fundamental concern for all Baha'is. And I think this is extremely important, that Baha'is don't just stand by and say that it's up to everyone else. We do our part by trying to raise awareness, bring people together to raise consciousness about the importance of the lesser peace and the principles that apply to it. Okay, so in this regard to the lesser peace and to the general Baha'i program for peace, I want to just give you what Baha'is are doing, give you a bit of a picture, if I may, about what Baha'is are doing right now throughout the world in promoting some of these principles that we've discussed tonight. So this is the actual action part that Baha'is are engaged in. Baha'is, first of all, are working within their communities with others. Whether they are Baha'is or not, it doesn't matter. They are working with people around them to create and enlarge an inclusive system of social organization based on Baha'i principles and on the best ideas and concepts taken from the secular world. They are learning how to develop communities in which children are raised without any form of racial, national, or religious prejudice. They promote an endeavor to defend the full equality of women in all community and societal matters. They engage in transformative programs of education that explores the material and spiritual aspects of life, and they welcome all to engage with them in building healthy and vibrant communities, socially, materially, spiritually. They welcome everyone, whether religious or not, in exploring the solutions to the problems faced at the grassroots level and by humanity as a whole. In this context, every person has a role to play in serving society based on his or her individual abilities. In the Baha'i view, spiritual life is not separate from the realm of the social relations within the larger society, but integrated with it. Now, so that's the lesser peace and what the Baha'i community is doing now. It would be incomplete if I didn't say that after the lesser peace, the Baha'i writings indicate that the most great peace will inevitably follow as a result and the practical consequence of the spiritualization of the world. So sometime in the future, Baha'is do not know when, the Baha'i writings do not indicate when, but it's after the lesser peace, when there has been a greater degree of the spiritualization of the world and the unification of its peoples, there will be a movement towards this global civilization. Now, in the Baha'i writings, some is said about that civilization, but I don't want to go, it's nothing that's concrete, if you will. It is very much dependent on our hard work now and into the future of establishing these principles and promoting these principles in all human affairs and building strong institutions to promote such principles. So in a sense, the most great peace will be as the outcome of the Baha'i faith itself and its principles. And we see the House of Justice as the institution that will guide that process. So I would now like to just give you one last example of the Baha'i writings in relation to what that future world might look like. And that is that in the Baha'i writings, the example that's held up is federalism. It's the United States of America, 50 states that form a federation in which the Constitution says no state is below or above any other state. They're all unified, they're all equal, okay? Now, this model is what the Baha'i writings believe that the future world will look like. You have individual nations, but you really have the communities of the nations of the world under a federation system. And again, I don't need to go into too much detail about that, but I want to just conclude by saying that the Baha'i faith's concept of peace is multifaceted, multi-layered, and multitudinous. It's very complex, but it's complex because to change this world, a world which is very happy with wars and conflict, into a peaceful world is not an easy task. And it will take a long, long time. But it also requires the work of Baha'is and non-Baha'is alike to perform specific acts to assist in the process of peace building. It does not believe, Baha'is do not believe in a utopian set of religious ideas that transpose rational thought or scientific inquiry. And it is measured in its assumption of what human beings can accomplish while also being relentlessly hopeful in humankind's ability to advance itself. Ultimately, Baha'i beliefs describe a peace that radiates inward before radiating ever outward. The kingdom of peace, salvation, uprightness, and reconciliation is founded in the invisible world, the Baha'i writings tell us. And it will, by degrees, become manifest and apparent through the power of the Word of God or spiritual teachings. As humanity's spiritual understanding and capacity expands and possibility of a peaceful world becomes achievable, Baha'i laws, ordinances, and principles, when translated into action, are intended to expand human understanding, uplift human conditions, and spiritualize human life. So going back to what Margaret Macmillan said, we need some kind of a moment where humanity will reach a level of consciousness to understand how to bring an end to war. The Baha'is believe that that consciousness is this ongoing process as outlined in the Baha'i writings, and that every single individual, every soul on this planet can have a part in that wonderful, wonderful endeavor. Thank you.
Can I ask the first question, Hoda? I would love to know a little bit more about the Baha'i Chair for World Peace.
Sure.
What you do, how many students, what kind of classes you teach, how many students you graduate every year, are all your students Baha'is? Tell us a little bit more about that.
The Baha'i Chair is not a department, it is a chair. And as such, it means that when a chair is established at a university, it usually has a goal to accomplish. And when the Baha'i Chair was established, it was to implement the ideas that were put forth in the Universal House of Justice's peace statement about removing the barriers to peace, which is really the Baha'i writings. But Baha'i Chair is in a secular setting. It is at a public institution, and its intention is not teaching the Baha'i religion, but it does draw from Baha'i ideas about how to bring about world peace. And what it does is it invites the best scholars who are doing exquisite research and finding solutions, even though they may be small steps, but nevertheless moving forward in relation to the barriers to peace. So the Baha'i Chair has 5 themes that it promotes: structural racism and the root cause of prejudice, the empowerment of women in peace, global governance, the challenge of the environment and climate change, and understanding human nature. It promotes these 5 themes by inviting scholars to come and give lectures about their findings. And then we take maybe those talks and maybe other papers that these scholars write and publish them in books that will be used at universities, that will be used by individuals, by organizations, corporations, whoever. So it's education, it's research, and it's publication. The Baha'i Chair has 2 staff and myself. None of them are Baha'is. I teach a course on the problem of prejudice, and it is offered every year on campus. And the students come from all walks of life and from all backgrounds. And it's a class that basically we do all the reading before we come to class. And in class, we take up the different forms of prejudice: race, sex, politics, nationalism, poverty, poverty meaning inequalities, all of these issues. And so the goal is to impart knowledge and the ideas that are within the Baha'i teachings, but doing it within an academic setting.
Okay. Wahid Hidayati, who says he served with you on the National Teaching Committee
Yes.
ago,
Yes.
says thanks you for your talk. And he asks if he can have a copy of this talk, which we will have on YouTube. And I will, of course, Wahid knows I send him a copy of every talk anybody does, so he knows that he will get a talk. Now, there was a question that came in on YouTube that Chris.
May I just, I saw
Sure.
that he was online, and I of course, I remember him, and my greetings to him. Thank you.
So the person on YouTube makes a comment and says, this way of changing societies will take 1,000 years. We need fast working solutions for today's people.
You know, I'm all in favor of fast solutions, especially right now.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, that's not how real change that is, how shall I say, that has a solid foundation. That's now not how it's built. And I want to tell you why I think that's the case. You know, usually we think that the way to change things is to go after one cause after another, right? Today it's this, tomorrow it's that, the next day it's something else. But really, in order to bring about lasting change, it requires that we all first agree and unify around principles in order to solve problem after problem.
Mhm.
You know, just take climate change. It's a horrible problem. It's awful. Already we see its implications. We see, you know, problems with food security, water security, countries that are sinking, coastlines that are sinking, the degradation of the air, the pollution, et cetera, et cetera. But until, again, I would say predominantly the leaders of the world and the major private sector organizations of the world come together and agree on the principles. In other words, draw up a policy of how to solve this problem. It's not going to happen. And
It's not.
Baha'is believe that, remember, the forces of integration and disintegration, you can't force it. Even if you tried, you can't force it, because there will always be dissension. There will always be someone which will sabotage. So I agree with you. It's a long, long process.
There's a question from a good friend, Chris Johnson. I'm going to read it to you because I'm not totally sure of the question. Chris is a sociologist. He teaches sociology at a local university here. He said, one way to look at this is the Baha'i thesis of unity of nations and globalization. This theme is being countered by nationalism and resistance to change, antithesis. As a sociologist, I'm sure you're familiar with Hegel's discussion of the triad of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is the unity of mankind, a progression of three ideas or propositions. The first idea, the thesis, is formal statement like illustrating point of the oneness of humankind. God, where am I? I'm not sure I totally know what this question is, but at the end he says this process has attempted to contradict or negate the first, and lastly, sometime in the future or soon we will the third idea, the synthesis, which resolves the conflict between the thesis and antithesis, or the lesser piece. The thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that triad actually originated with Johann Fichte, not Hegel. I'm not, I don't understand the question well enough to even
I
ask it.
would be happy to maybe talk to him, but I think I can't right now go through the whole description of Hegel's antithesis, thesis, and
I'll copy the question. I'll copy the whole question and email it to you.
I don't
And
know
we'll copy.
this. Yeah.
Okay. Arastu and Rehane say, thank you for the talk. You probably know them. Arastu and Rehane served the same time as you did in
Good to see
Haifa.
them, and I thank them. Thank you.
Yeah, they're wonderful members of our community, really, truly wonderful additions to
Yes.
our community. Why am I saying additions? I'm here long. I came here later than they did. So yes, Other questions, comments? Chris, you have anything on questions on
No, we don't have any
YouTube?
questions. I was wondering if Professor Mahmoudi has some suggestions or things that people would want to read or look up after listening to her talk, like maybe a reading list or something like that.
Gosh, I have huge reading lists, of course. Reading is always good. In any specific area?
Well, let's say somebody's a layperson that they haven't really touched on this subject at all. Where would they start to learn more?
Peace, the subject of peace, from a Baha'i perspective?
Let's say from the wider community.
Wider community, okay. Well, I can, let's see, I can perhaps provide a list to Ajit to then give to the rest of you, because there are many different ways of looking at peace. And so I'd have to give you a longer list, I think, than just one or two, if that's okay.
I have to ask a question here, and I'm not trying to get political, so I'm going to try to stay away from politics. But there is a tendency amongst nations, all nations, to at some point get up and say, we are first and the heck with the rest of the world. You know, America first, China first, whatever. And that's the kind of anthem that almost seems to be very attractive to people. You know, we need to take care of our people first before we do anything for anybody else. Why should we be part of a global environmental treaty when it reduces the jobs for us? How do you counteract that kind of thought process, that kind of force? And it's quite popular in America, at least right now. That kind of thought process is very popular.
First of all, I think the trends that we see happening, this movement towards nationalism and populism, you know, there are reasons for these trends. I mean, globalization, which started some of these trends, globalization, because it was not done correctly in relation to the people's needs, brought about enormous inequalities, you know? So there is a reason why there is a group of people who are reacting as they do now. They're angry, they're upset, they've lost their jobs, they have no jobs, they're sort of the forgotten, if you will. So, you know, I think the answer, I don't have one answer, but I can just say this, that what kind of a world would we like to have? I think that's where we have to start the conversation. In other words, can we conceive of a different world? And what might that world look like? Because unless we do that, we will be stuck in the current world order, which is unfortunately based on all the things that bring about more conflict, more violence, more inequalities. And again, that's the domain of the lesser peace, which is the leaders of the world will have to somehow come together and find ways to address these issues. And I don't mean to skirt your question, because it's a very good question. Yes. But we have to, you know, we have to conceive of the kind of world that we want to build. And when I mentioned what Baha'is are doing in their communities, that's a part of that conception of a different world. Now, I agree, we are in the primitive age. You know, we're just starting. We're starting. But one has to start somewhere. You know, let me give you an example. I'm sorry, I'm an academician, but Harvard University is touted as one of the best universities and this and that. And I don't, you know, that's fine. But, you know, if one reads how that institution started, it's a great example of how small steps and a small group of people over time can achieve amazing things. It hardly had, it was started by some minister, he hardly had any money, and, worked extremely hard to come up with enough funds to at least have a roof where, it could be called a classroom and this and that. Harvard started like that. That's really its beginnings, with basically nothing. But this group of people had a vision. They had a vision, and they had hope that they would accomplish that vision. That's what it takes in this world. It's that vision, persistence, and staying with that vision and not being distracted by it.
Other questions, anybody? Adib Masumian, any questions? Adib is the intellectual in this group, so we always have great questions.
Actually, there is a question from Sanaz that says, you mentioned that World War II shifted human consciousness. Do you think that COVID-19 would have similar impact and shift the world towards peace? Excellent question. The pandemic is one of those moments of disintegration, especially in the US, but also for the whole world.
Yeah.
It actually exposed everything. It exposed our total lack of a global response. It exposed, although we knew, but it exposed further the inequalities in this world. And it really exposed the dysfunctions of institutions.
Mhm.
And I think it is one of those moments. I'm not one to predict things, but I do think that there's so much human suffering going on right now because of this pandemic. I mean, you all know, where do we start to talk about the suffering? Of course, we start with deaths of loved ones, the passing of loved ones, of the caretakers who are overburdened, overtaxed, and lose their own lives in the process, of the families that are impacted by these first responders and the people who deliver groceries, pack the shelves in the groceries, this and that, the restaurants. Where do we begin? And then the people who are not employed, who've lost their businesses, who don't have money, who are lining up to get food. Of course, there is a moment right now which humanity is undergoing through an enormous level of suffering. And I think when we come out of this, I don't think things will ever be what they were. And I think we don't even know all the ramifications of what is to come. And I would say to come for more than 1 or 2 decades. So I think I agree with your question. It might shift us closer to further integration, but it's going to be very hard work. It's going to be very hard work.
Chris, you have any questions for Dr. Mahmoudi? Texted in?
I think there was one more question in chat from Greg.
Okay.
I don't know if Dr. Mahmoudi can read it.
From, let me see, from Greg, about policy would be, okay. I agree that policy would be almost impossible. On time frame, the best way is almost never the easy, shorter way. But hypothetically, would there be any policy that would help guide people, communities in not being prejudiced? For example, goals set by the Paris Climate Agreement. Would we challenge nations to meet certain goals related to prejudice? What a great question. Thank you, Greg. I love the fact that, to have a Paris Agreement, such an example of a Paris Agreement that would get nations to think about how to eliminate prejudice. Greg, I wish it was that easy. In in my humble opinion, this scourge of prejudice, especially racial prejudice, runs so deep that even we are not always aware of our own implicit bias. And, you know, of course, the Baha'i writings help us to find ways to really candidly discuss this problem. But I think this is one of those problems that starts with the individual, taking account of him or herself, because all of us are biased. I would like to meet a human being that doesn't have some kind of a bias. But in order to get rid of our stereotypes and bias and prejudices, the first step is our own recognition that I am prejudiced. That's the very first step. And every kind of research done on this comes to this conclusion. Therefore, I think regarding prejudice, we need to have lots of conversations, but good conversations, constructive conversations, conversations that are both based on secular knowledge and spiritual knowledge in order to tackle this problem. Because eliminating racial prejudice, as we've witnessed, you know, slavery started 4,000 years ago, 4 centuries ago. And look at where we are still in this country. So my feeling is that we need to, and I can again provide a list of books if you'd like that are non-Baha'i, that address this issue. Because it takes education, but it takes spiritual and secular education. And it takes honest conversation. We need to listen to people who are the victims of prejudice. We need to hear them. We need to learn from them. We need to understand what they're saying to us. It's not enough to watch things on TV or hear them on the radio. We need to be realistic about this and sit with people who are experiencing these prejudices and learn from them, and then apply the spiritual principles, first to ourselves, and then in the community, and then, of course, the wider society.
Chris asked a question. He says, do you see individualism as a social pathology in America and in fundamentalist religions? It appears our society has very little sense of community, in my view. Would you agree?
Good question. Individualism is very much alive in America. Although I would say if we were to go back and to read the founding fathers, you know, all the things that they went through to establish this new nation, I think we would see that their intentions were not entirely to create this level of individualism. But unfortunately, because they lived in a whole different time than we live in now, they thought that those were the best ideas. And some of them are still the best ideas. And to this day, I'm amazed that men from, you know, Europe and England actually brought those ideas to this part of the world and created those ideas. But individualism is an aspect of capitalism, I would like to say. It's not just fundamentalist religion. No, it isn't just capitalism. When capitalism is allowed to just take its course without any consideration for social security, for the well-being of the population, and that the bottom line is profit, then I think you will have enormous difficulties with individualism. That's one aspect of it. The other, of course, goes back to, I guess, some of the ideas that were formed, maybe the Second Amendment. You know, I don't want to get into all of that, but where you know, at one time militias, you know, there was a time this country didn't have a military like we have today. I mean, we have to look at this in context. Militias were formed in order to, you know, fight something, fight a conflict, or bring peace or whatever. Now, things are much more complicated, much more complex. Do we want individuals to act as militias still? Because we did at one time, and it was actually probably helpful at that time. So these are the aspects of individualism that I think every country has to address, including this one. And, you know, I think, again, how we educate students from K through 12 in relation to these issues, these are extremely important. I don't know if you, in Japan, for example, in elementary school, it starts with elementary school, where they teach children, you know, how to work in groups, how to be a group. They actually have students clean the classroom. The students, I'm talking elementary school. Those are ways you do away with individualism. Those are the ways you create an environment which says that we can work together and we can serve one another. We can clean our own classroom and take pride in how clean our classroom is, you know? I'm talking 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, you know? Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question.
So there's a question from YouTube.
Yes.
What shifts in consciousness are occurring around the world that the United States is largely unaware of? Is our country still on the forefront, or have we fallen behind in the pursuit of world peace?
Look.
What change in consciousness?
Yeah, you know, there are many things that are taking place in the world, and I don't know how to answer that question, because what region are we looking at? What topic are we thinking about? I mean, you know, one could say that China and the US have now become these two countries that are trying to find their place in the international order. And some of that is a competition, right? And some of it is not. I would say that the US, whether it's fallen behind or not, I don't know what that might be based on. I know that there are certain things that are in decline in this country. But that doesn't mean that other countries don't have issues that are also in decline, because I think they do. I think every country has problems, and every country has major issues to address. The US, interestingly enough, is unique, as I said, because there's no system like the United States of America in the world, where, you know, you have these 50 states that are in some ways independent, but not. And in that sense, it's a very great model. But even that model is tested at times, right? And we know that it's tested at times. But it doesn't mean that the potential is not there for America to continue to maneuver through the tests that are sent its way. I think it will eventually pass one test after another. But nothing prevents the US or any other country from the forces of disintegration and integration.
Oh, I know. I go to India occasionally, and I realize how much like Americans they have become. Uh, there's a question here that says, what are the current academic learning on human nature that align with or confirm the Baha'i views of the spiritual nature of man?
Uh-huh. Interesting question. You know, there are many scholars these days who are actually positive about human nature. And by that I mean, for a long time and still, many intellectuals and many people, I don't want to just say academics, many people believe that we are innately violent people, that human beings, no matter what, will eventually, they'll compete, they'll be individualistic, they'll cause violence, and they'll go to war, this and that. And they're self-interested. Now, I don't deny that, and many scholars do not deny that we have that tendency. We have the potential for that. But they point out, one of them has done actually very interesting research historically, showing that if human beings had not cooperated throughout history, we would not have survived. We would not have survived. And that it is largely because of our cooperation that we've come this far. They also point out, actually interestingly enough, that there are cycles of violence or decline, much like integration and disintegration, pardon me, and cycles of integration or cooperation and collaboration. That's one area. The other, and you undoubtedly know about Steven Pinker, who wrote a book in which he says that actually violence is on a decline. And he has table after table that shows how violence is decreasing in the world. And he is actually very positive about this. So that's another aspect of human nature. There are also studies with infants and children that show from a very early age, how infants respond to an adult that is crying and go over to the adult and want to, first of all, if they're too young, they will notice that something's wrong, just that alone. And if they're maybe a toddler, they'll want to go and comfort that adult. I mean, these are indications that, we're not all that bad. But education and spiritual education combined with education is extremely important in relation to human nature. And I think many academicians are beginning to realize that some of those old theories really were incorrect.
Hoda, we will be here all night because the questions keep coming in.
Sure.
So let me ask you one last question. And this comes from a friend here named Jay Braden. He says, Dr. Mahmoudi, thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm wondering what insights you have gleaned in your work with the Baha'i Chair for Peace, which might elevate our sites and practices with core activities and other activities at the local level.
I'm sorry, the last part I didn't.
What insights have you gathered that would help us elevate our activities at the local level, the core activities and other activities locally?
Well, it's never good for an outsider to tell local people what to do. You know that. That's very patronizing. All I can say is that your local setting better than anyone. But you also know that you know what we are charged with to do, to accomplish. And so anything that raises human consciousness about bettering some aspect of our neighborhood, of our community, of our city, of our anything in that direction I think would be extremely helpful. Because, again, I want to just go back to what I said. It only takes a small group of people who are dedicated to a cause. If they stick with it, and if they continue to look at how to improve upon that cause, they will get places. They will get to places. So I can't tell local people what to do. I can only tell myself what to do, right? And I would just encourage you to find ways of coming together and finding things that are helpful and meaningful in your setting. And I would also remind you that speaking of the Baha'i Chair, I want you to know that every speaker who speaks for us, unless they choose otherwise, we record them, and their talks are on YouTube channel. And like if in a community you want to explore racism in this country, we've had some of the top scholars in this country come and speak about racism. It might be helpful for some of you to pick a video and listen to it.
Yeah.
And then have a discussion. Or about global governance. We've had great talks about women, about all these themes that I mentioned. So that's one possibility to consider.
So I know you said you can give us advice remotely from Maryland. So let me extend to you an offer. Whenever this COVID is over, you're welcome to come visit Austin. We would warmly welcome you. And we're hoping very soon to have a time when we can actually see each other face to face. This stuff's getting pretty old. I was telling somebody I feel like I've been under house arrest for the last few months. So thank you on behalf of all of us gathered here. I thank you tremendously, Dr.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It's really been wonderful to be with you, and I thank you very much.
I will send you a copy of this video here whenever it should be available. Chris Bishop does this, so it should be available within the next day or so. I'll send it to you. So let's say the formal part of this event is over. Those of you that want to